Not stupid, they're fabulous.
Okay, alright, here we go. So my Pubspeak is going to be divided into two parts. The first part will involve me talking, and the second part is going to involve you talking. So when I started out on this Pubspeak, I figured I was going to talk about the Electoral College, because that's a subtopic I feel very strongly about and hate with a furious burning passion. Why, you will learn later in the Pubspeak. But then I decided that it would probably be best to set up the background of how the Electoral College came to be in the Constitution, a whole bunch of stuff like that, because that's what I've been thinking about as regards my essay. So yesterday I was thinking about it. I came to the conclusion that the tier diagram like this would maybe be a good idea to express how the Founding Fathers sort of decided to organize American society. It's not like a perfect analogy, but I think it's pretty good. So basically I was reading that when the Founding Fathers convened in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, in their minds, the concept of a democracy was very specific, was very separate from that of a republic, which is what they want for the United States. To them, democracy evoked the idea the Greek polis, and direct rule by the masses, which to them just held the connotation of mob rule and a ton of avenues down which they feared to tread or whatever. So they decided more to put the United States as a republic, so give the people the power to choose their rulers, but to set it up as a system so there wasn't generally direct rule by the people. So I sort of express this as a tier system. So tier 1 would be the groups that are elected directly by the people. So that would be presumably the individual state legislatures, which will be elected by the people of the state. And then as well as the House of Representatives, which was also directly elected. So then in the tier above would be the institutions that were chosen by those. And since the original Constitution provided for the Senate to be chosen by state legislatures, that also provided the Senate. As well as state legislatures appointed electors to the Electoral College, so that's where it belonged. Now on top of that, the Electoral College chose the president, so the president would be in tier 3, and the president, with advice and consent from the Senate, would pick the Supreme Court and the cabinet. So that was sort of the tier system that we ended up with originally. Of course, over time, things changed, and I would argue that the trend over the last 2 centuries has been more or less more away from the Republican model, not Republican as in the party, Republican as in of a republic, and more towards a straightforward democracy. So for example, in response to the progressive movement demanding more democracy, we had a lot of reforms. For example, on the state level, some states implemented recalls to the recall system for elected officials and individual referenda. And we also had the Senate become directly elected with, I think it was the 17th Amendment. So the Senate moved down to tier 2. However, and in addition, the electors, as this was happening, more and more states began to pass their responsibility for choosing electors onto their people of the state. So the Electoral College as well moved down to tier 1, and obviously the president moves down, Supreme Court, cabinet. So overall, everything is closer to the people now. The problem is sort of the way that this went about, and especially as regards to the Electoral College. So I guess before we go into that, I should say a few more things about the story of the Electoral College itself. So the idea was that each state would receive a number of electors equal to its representation in Congress. We all know that. Number of House membership is based on population, Senate membership, 2 members for each state. Everyone's happy. And the implication of this system is obviously that smaller states get comparatively more weight because, for example, an electoral vote in a state which, like Wyoming, which has no people, yet it still has 3 electoral votes, as opposed to the more populous states, such as, for example, New York and California, which have many more people, but in comparison, they have less electoral votes per person. So what happened when the states began devolving authorities from the legislature to the people is that instead of these legislatures appointing individual electors, the people would just vote for the electors. And so obviously, individual candidates would run whole slates of electors. So example, if there's I think 20 electors in Pennsylvania now, so candidates would run 20 electors all pledging to vote for this particular candidate. And people would obviously, as casting votes for the candidate, vote for all of those electors. So the system became something of a winner-takes-all sort of system. In other words, in most states, if you capture the state's popular votes, then you get all of the electors. And usually that doesn't, usually the outcome of the national vote will coincide with the outcome of the electoral vote. Of course, it doesn't always. So I had a couple interesting anecdotes there, but I think I'm going to breeze past them in the interest of talking about one of my favorite elections, the election of 2000. So I have a couple facts and figures here. So the official count of the popular vote remains to this day. Al Gore won 50,999,897 votes, and George W. Bush won 50,456,002. And in the state of Florida, independent vote counters have verified that Gore won the state by about 100 votes. However, the vote count that was certified and eventually went to decide the election was a margin of 537 votes in favor of Bush. That was the result on election night that was certified by Florida Secretary of State Katherine Harris, who incidentally was the manager of the Bush campaign in Florida. Not accusing her of anything, just pointing that out. I'm also going to point out the fact that the governor of Florida at the time was one Jeb Bush, brother of George W. Bush. So, anyway. Now this thing isn't just a constitutional anomaly. This has happened before. And in fact, the one election that I'd also like to point out is 1888. And this election is really interesting in that what happened in 2000 was George Bush, and although Al Gore won a plurality, he didn't win an outright majority of the votes. In 1888, however, Samuel Tilden did win 51% of the popular vote. Now, I haven't done exhaustive research, but I'm pretty sure in every single democracy on planet Earth, except the United States, that would have given him the presidency. However, in the United States, this time the state in question was South Carolina. And what Congress did was they appointed a panel of 15 people. 8 of them were Republicans and 7 Democrats. And the deciding vote was cast by a Supreme Court justice who happened to be Republican. You can see that although those parallels are more interesting coincidentally than actual historically, but it's still really interesting to think about. So that's one of the main reasons that I don't like the Electoral College. Number one, because candidates who don't win a majority of the popular vote, or who even lose the popular vote, can be elected. In addition, there's also the fact, as I mentioned before, that states which have smaller populations tend to be overrepresented. And that especially applies to states with somewhat larger populations that nevertheless are swing states, so like Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Florida, because candidates tend to spend all their time and money, or the vast majority of time and money, campaigning in those states. And that's not just like a perception, actual statistical analyses of candidate visits and money spent have shown that that is the case. And as a result, the issues that some states, even some of the largest states like Texas or California or New York, care about are shunted to the side, because everyone knows no matter what you do, California and New York will vote Democrat and Texas is going to vote Republican. As well, there's something that I'm not sure how many people know about, and that's the idea of a faithless elector. So, according to the Constitution, the only vote count that really matters is the elector's actual vote. So all these shenanigans that we've been talking about are related to the process of choosing the electors. But once the electors vote, according to the strict letter of the Constitution, the nation is bound by those votes. So that obviously leaves avenue for something that's called a faithless elector. A faithless elector is someone who's pledged to vote for one candidate, but eventually goes back on their word. And so in the election of 2000, there was actually one faithless elector. Let me see if I have a name. Barbara Lett Simmons was the elector for Washington, D.C., and she abstained in protest over Washington, D.C. not being represented in Congress. So now that obviously didn't have any impact on the vote overall, but it's not difficult to imagine how a conspiracy of even 5 or so electors getting together could tip the election. Now obviously that's probably not going to happen, but I mean, why take the risk? So for a long time I've been thinking a great idea would be to abolish the Electoral College system and move to a direct popular vote. But how to do that remains a problem. Because another issue that we've been confronting as our nation has become more and more powers in the hands of the people, direct vote for lots and lots of officials, is the fact that we've become much more and more partisan. And we've seen that everywhere, and that's especially true today. So I can't help but thinking like a direct popular vote, how much is that going to help? Because in all likelihood, I've gone back for the past century, about half of the elections, one candidate receives a majority, fine, he wins. In the other half of elections, both candidates receive a plurality, and under most systems, except for in Mexico, which is kind of weird, in most systems, when neither candidate wins a majority, then the 2 top candidates go to a runoff, in which presumably one candidate has to win a majority. So the problem I see with that system is it would just keep perpetuating the same old 2-party system, because the 2 highest vote getters in any election are going to be the Republican and the Democrat. It's just not going to happen any other way, unless we get a plausible third-party candidate in there. There is, however, another system, which I think is really interesting, and it's known as the alternative vote or the ranked voting system. So okay, under this system what happens is you rank your favorite candidates. All the candidates on the ballot from your favorite number 1 all the way down. So when the votes are counted, they see first if one candidate has won a majority. If not, then the candidate who wins the lowest number of votes gets dropped. And then all of his or her, all the second choices of the people who picked him or her are going to be distributed. And so on and so on and so on until one candidate finally crosses the 50% line, at which point you can say, okay, this candidate has support from a majority of Americans, at least, and so they ought to become president. And the advantage I see with that system is the idea that third parties could potentially play more of a role. Now, not just third parties don't, because a lot of third parties today, we're familiar with them as like the parties that have no chance of ever being elected to office, so they mainly focus on like advocacy work and trying to present one particular cause to the public eye. But I think a really valuable consequence of this system could be the chance to get to use more and more other parties coming in, like offering an alternative, like maybe a moderate party, because we know both parties are more polarized than ever. I think it's in the House of Representatives that the most conservative Democrat is still to the left of the most liberal Republican. So there is like literally no corresponding ground between the parties, and that's for like the first time in history. So I think like a centrist moderate party would be a really good idea, and just to offer the people more variety. And I think that if this turns out right, if it doesn't like turn into like a parliamentary system, because in America traditionally, because we've had a two-party system, it's been traditionally very hard for one party to govern on its own because there's been so much ideological overlap between these two parties that they've usually had to reach across the aisle for votes, but they're not trying to do that anymore. So I figure that if there are more parties in the system, then that would offer more of an opportunity for ideological compromise across certain lines. So I was sort of interested in trying to do a little experiment with voting, comparing the Electoral College system to the direct popular vote to the alternative vote system. So I was going to conduct a hypothetical 2012 presidential election. So bear with me for a minute. So let's assume for the purposes of argument that we have 4 candidates. One would be Obama, who as we all hopefully know is a Democrat. One would be Romney, who, as we all know, hopefully again, is a Republican. Next we would have Jill Stein, who's running on behalf of the Green Party. And then we would have Gary Johnson, who's running on behalf of the Libertarian Party. So just to give you the ordinary 2 parties plus a sort of fringe third party from either end of the ideological spectrum. So when I was coming up with this, I sort of wondered about how we could break it up like the Electoral College. So I figured let's have 3 states. One state would be evolution, one state would be modernism, and one state would be the factotum. And because states with lower population are overrepresented in the Electoral College, I figured that the factotum, instead of, so each of the seminars would have 8 electoral votes, but the factotum would have 4, because smaller population, more representation.
Wait, can the international kids vote too?
Sure. Okay. So you don't have to vote for your ideological preference. Just try to keep this interesting. So if I could see hands from the evolution people, how many? I guess let's start with just do it individually. How many evolution people would vote for of these 4 Obama? 1, 2, 3, 4. How many would vote for Romney?
Yeah.
How many would vote for Stein?
Stein.
4. How many would vote for Johnson?
Woo!
Spotlight. I'm personally just going to put my vote in for Obama to make this easier to divvy up. Or no, I'll. It's 5. Okay, modernism seminar. How many would vote for Obama? 4, 5, 6. How many didn't vote?
1 didn't vote.
1 didn't vote in our seminar. Who didn't? Oh, who? Could you just pick one? Sorry?
Stein.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So it wasn't me. So now so that would make my vote the deciding one then.
Vote for Romney. Vote for Romney.
Okay, I'll just
Go green.
Go for Romney.
Do Romney.
You're not allowed to persuade other people. It's like a basic tenet.
I'll just put Stein.
Yeah, right. How all voting is decided.
So how many modernism kids vote for Romney?
No, nobody.
How many modernism votes for
Sanjay?
Go.
Thank you.
There it is.
How many modernism for Johnson?
Yeah, for Bill.
Woo.
Bill is Johnson.
I am
Someone
someone that vote.
There we go. I'm glad it is turning out.
Who didn't vote?
Who didn't vote?
Is there some?
Okay.
Okay, throw one on Sanjay.
Yeah.
John.
Give Romney a vote.
We need a tiebreaker.
Oh,
Wait,
yeah,
Yeah, poor Romney. Give him a vote.
I'm not afraid to admit
That is not
That
true.
is just a-
Jack?
Jack just voted twice.
Yeah, he just voted twice.
The
system's all screwed up.
How many vote for Obama?
No variety.
So those are those real votes?
So Obama wins facto to calm, obviously. Stein wins evolution, so that's 8.
Yes.
Yeah. And how are we going to break the modernism tie?
4 and 4.
Half, half. 4, 4.
Fine. 4 and 4.
That's tiny.
So I guess the point I was trying to make was that Obama would win, but since this is a group of task force, that's obviously not true. So
You asked us to keep it.
Can we do like actual preferences?
okay, so just humor me for purposes of interest. Sure. Because let's count up how many votes they actually had as opposed to like electoral votes. So 5, 10, 2, 12, and 7. So we can see here that no candidate has a majority, or so I don't. So the majority would be, we have 34 people. So the majority would be 18, right? So 17 would be split half and half. 15. So we drop the 2 Romney votes, and now Romney people get to pick again.
Johnson.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So now we don't have a majority, so now we drop Johnson. So all the Johnson people need to vote again. So how many Johnson?
Abstain.
That might happen. That might happen. I mean, if your candidate gets a little. No,
Yeah,
wait,
let's
it
see
wouldn't
Obama.
happen in my voting. So never mind. Okay.
Wait. I'm going to vote for John Stein.
So how many former Johnson people would vote Obama?
Oh,
poor Joe.
5.
Switch to Stein.
Just a guttural.
What? No.
Switch to Stein.
How many former Obama people would vote Stein?
Former Johnson people or?
Former Johnson. There it is.
Wait,
How do we get 11 out of 19?
So I have Okay, we need to do that again. That is actually bad math.
How did we get 11
Stein's
votes out of
campaign
9?
manager.
It's an experiment.
Yes!
New president.
So my point was that Stein would act. So my point was that in the electoral college version of things, Obama would probably win. Then in the alternative vote version of things, Stein would probably win. But anyway, so now I sort of want to open this up for discussion and talk not just about like the electoral college or what you think of this potential alternative, but also like what you think of like practical things we can do to help American democracy in general. Like what can be done with the media, like what could be done with the Supreme Court. Like it could be laws passed, it could be like constitutional reform to change the way things are done. It could be just like a sort of popular movement. It could be starting a new court. So what are your thoughts?
Districts from the state legislatures. I've heard a statistic that 85% of all House elections are not competitive, but except for the primaries, where they are the more polarized candidate is more likely to win.
That's good. Michael?
2 questions. Number 1, any thoughts on the Reform Party? And number 2, what do you think of the very strange way Maine and Nebraska do electoral college votes?
Okay, yeah, I was actually going to address that. So for those of you who don't know, I'll talk about the second part first.
Okay, sure.
So for those of you who don't know, Maine and Nebraska, they apportion their votes by individual congressional district. So the individual House districts, whoever wins a vote in that district gets that particular one electoral vote for doing that, and then the person who wins the state overall gets the 2 extra electoral votes that correspond to the Senate seat. And while that's generally a better and more representative way of doing things, it doesn't remove like what I see as a fundamental problem, which is you can elect a candidate who, even if a majority of people support another guy. I mean, it's much less likely under the current system, but it can happen. But as, like, say, an individual, a stepping stone in the road to constitutional reform, I think that would be a good idea, because that's something that the individual states can undertake. And, like, the last time we tried to pass an amendment to move to direct popular vote was, I think, in the 60s, and that was a non-starter, because, like, a ton of small states were like, no, we like having more political power than the rest of you guys. So maybe that could be an acceptable compromise in the short term. Jack?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. Partly because this is a debate topic, so.
Oh, right.
Yes,
Oh, yeah, I
true.
remember.
One suggestion maybe, which is, this is a serious discussion I've had in school, but would be to reintroduce earmarks and other forms of like legalized corruption. Because that's how you get stuff done. But my question. I'm totally serious.
He's actually
totally
right.
serious.
Can you like elaborate on
Because
how that would help?
if there's nothing in it for the other guy, he's not going to help you with it. But the other thing was, do you think that like with the introduction of a third party, right? Like, do you think that's really like that's actually a reasonable expectation that you could introduce a third party or multiple parties and avoid like what is essentially a parliamentary system that's based on coalitions, which I see as more problematic than people.
Yeah, and I've thought about that for a lot of time. I think like a way to avoid that might be having a bunch of people run as independents. Like in Maine, there's the guy running for the Senate to replace Olympia Snows. King, he's a former governor, and he's running as a fierce independent. He's not yet said whether or not he's going to caucus with the Republicans or Democrats, and he's actually leading the polls right now. So I think if we could get more people like that, maybe not like an organized party, but that or who are more fluid in their beliefs and reasonably centrist in their attitudes, that they could like serve as a sort of bridge. So like not necessarily like adhering to one party, but maybe like going on to one side on a certain issue, but going with the other side on another.
Alright, so then do you see the issue is really like in the government or kind of in the people or kind of just electing shitty people?
I think the problem is that we, number one, are elected shitty people, and two, that we have a system that perpetuates that. Angie?
Okay, so 2 comments, 1 question. It was originally 1 comment, but then okay. So I guess my question would be I guess my question is like, do you think this ranking system, like ranking 1, 2, 3, 4 of your candidates, presupposes a level of political education / awareness among the citizens that they may or may not have? Just like wondering, because like if the average voter might not actually know that much about, for example, Stein or Johnson, do you think they could make, I guess, educated or well thought out choices? My 2 comments would be like the first, sort of addressing Jack's point. It is possible in a parliamentary system, even with 4 parties, to have stable governments, like in Canada right now. And my second comment was like, I feel like one thing that I'm uncomfortable with in the American political system is like the proliferation and influence of like the 24 news hour cycle. I feel like the media is more partisan than it should be, and I'm not sure if there's like regulation you can do to stop that, because then it starts like, you know, free press or whatever. But like I feel like that contributes to like polarization.
So going back to your question, I think it was how can third parties like attain recognition? Especially because like if you go and look at the ballot, there was actually like so many like independents and third party people that managed to get on the ballot somehow. No idea how. I don't know, like I know that Johnson definitely and Stein as well have stated their intention is to try to amass enough support. I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, what's the mark? Correct me if I'm wrong, it's the 5%?
The debate?
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
5%.
I think Johnson's going for 15 right now, according to Facebook. Yeah.
Open source knowledge.
But the 5% I think is for debates.
Yeah. So the gain of, and that's one way they can get recognized. I guess. I would say I would have suggested that a role the media could play is try to introduce the people to more candidates. And I'm trying to think like should there be some national awareness campaign? How that would be feasible? Would it even work out?
Like, are you assuming a level, I guess,
Okay.
do you know what I mean? Like, amongst ordinary voters
Okay.
to do their research for
can say maybe it's partly the responsibility of the campaigns to like get the message out there, but then I can see like a storm of leaflets descending on people's homes, like saying this is why you should vote for this person. I guess I don't have a good answer. Joseph?
Yeah. I mean, I guess most people I know vote that I know that vote mainly based on like slurs and stuff. And that's very easy to do when you have two halves, and if you're on one side, you're on the other, right? Like the two-party system. So I guess it doesn't seem to me like it seems to me that first of all that the electoral college works because it gets you as close to 50% as you can in a system that, for example, if you had a parliamentary, you can get a president. I think first off that ranking wouldn't work because you need computers for that because it's very hard to process that amount of slips and then have it recalculated to go down the list and then select the next person for everybody that didn't win first. And that kind of infrastructure would be really hard to put in place in near future, right? Because we've had like all the problems with the existing electronic machines from what I can tell. So isn't it a bit like, doesn't it make sense for the people that have a serious vested interest in the outcome of an election to not split up their resources? And because if you split it up into three, then you have a smaller pile going to every single person and a smaller pile to draw out of in terms of support later on. Because you don't turn to like your Republican friends, you have to turn to the Libertarian or whoever once you're a news anchor or a business owner or something. So like, is it in the best interest of people that have a good deal to say about who comes out of an election to split up that way rather than sticking with one or two?
What do you mean by that? People who have a vested interest.
Would it not divide support in general and affiliation to have more than two groups competing for presidency and thereby control of a lot of legislation that affects business and so on in America?
I see what you mean. That is a very good question. I'm not sure that I guess it could be argued that it would almost be that having more parties would almost enable like certain parties to represent certain constituencies better. Like I haven't had a good look at the Libertarian platform, but I gather it would probably be more business friendly than say the Republican platform, just because the Libertarian Party is so focused on keeping government out. So depending on like how much support a candidate is drawing. So I don't like automatically see like elections going to like 5 major candidates in the front runner, because even in the primaries there's traditionally like a front runner and people are trying to knock that front runner off their post. The other people. Sheree?
This is kind of in response to that. I agree that if you increase the number of parties, that you kind of decrease the amount of like that you're trying to pull things in too many different directions. But I think that the advantage of that is when, because I do get it would get pretty bad. Like I feel like it would split up and it would be more divisive. But I think that because it's more divisive, there would be a pushback in the opposite direction, if that makes sense, where there isn't one now. Because now there's like there's polarization, but there's still enough like unity, even if it's within the party, that like keeps people like happy with the way things are, sort of. Like they're like, oh, we're happy to all be Democrats and hate the Republicans or whatever. Like there's enough unity, like there's enough of a community sense that you can just like band around the common enemy and like be like, okay, we're like the Democrats and we don't talk to them. Whereas I think if we had a multi-party system, like because things would be split in so many directions, there'd be this pushback towards, okay, maybe we do need to establish some kind of unity because we are one country. And I feel like that would help, and now I think there'd be like a pushback almost in a sense. I don't know.
So in other words, like more parties would encourage parties to stand for something instead of against something.
Sorry, yeah.
Rachel?
Okay, so this kind of goes to Jack's question and Angie's question, but I think that like your remark about like more candidates running as independents, I feel like when candidates like first get into politics, they kind of like run with that like independent like maverick streak, like, oh, I'm like not gonna vote with like the party line every time, but then it just comes down to like money. Like you have to, like if you affiliate with the Democrats, you're gonna get like it's not like democratic money like from donors, and then you feel almost compelled to vote like almost like once you're elected in office, almost in exchange for that money instead of actually representing people. Because if you don't, because every single vote when you're in office I think is made with like re-election in mind. So I feel as though like that kind of like also was a argument point, but like Andrew's comment about like aren't you assuming level of education? I think that even if you reformed the electoral college to be something like similar to what you're describing, a lot of people would still maybe just like rank Obama 1 and Romney 2 because those are the two names that they're familiar with. So I think that it all comes down to just money, and if you're going to reform like the way like we choose the president, then you also have to make it so that that there's like the public financing system, but that's still like in my opinion like too much money. Like you need to somehow make campaigning so that every candidate has an equal opportunity to, I guess, like spread, like create awareness for like their platform necessarily, and not feel like they're compelled to like answer to like other interests.
Yeah, and that's another thing. Like I really want to reform campaign finance. Like I think Citizens United was a horrible idea, and I do think like even stricter limits than the original McCain-Fine goal do need to be in place. As that, I do think that I was also wondering, batting around the idea of maybe term limits for members of Congress would be a good idea, just to like avoid that perpetuation where, I mean, I am honestly not sure because a lot of people who are in Congress for 6, 7, 8, 9 terms are those who come from really exceptionally safe districts. They don't really have a chance to be tossed out, but it might be good to get new people in there to avoid that perpetuation, like being perpetually dependent on like the big business or big unions or whatever. Angie?
Sorry, that was just kind of the response to that. If you impose term limits, do you think you're depriving the institutions of like experience?
And that was the response that I had to that.
It might sound like a bit of a fluff question, but I'm actually really interested in hearing your thoughts. When do you think a presidential election is decided by? Like, by what point in time, more or less? Like, because I mean, do you know in late October? Is this the first time you know in exit polls on election day?
I think it's late October. Because I think the October surprise does actually play a very large role in deciding it. Jessica?
Okay, this is more of a general question, like I've been struggling with for a while, with the way the presidential election goes. It's every 4 years, and a lot of the times it's alternating parties, and if not every 4 years, a lot of the times every 8 years it's alternating parties. And especially now, things getting done at such a slow rate, like things passing barely, like crawling through Congress and crawling through, like, to get made into a law, like changing things and actually getting things to happen. Do you think that the presidential term limit and the way that it happens and the way that parties switch is like hurting that? But at the same time, you can't say let's get rid of a presidential term limit because then you're getting rid of like the spirit of democracy and leadership and so I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, first to back to think of, I think since World War II, no party has held the White House for more than 12 consecutive years. I think the longest time was Reagan, Bush. That was the longest time that one party would hold it in recent memory. I don't know. One thing I thought I was maybe going to a limit of 1 6-year term. I don't know, because I feel like that would give you more time to get things done. Because the problem with the current cycle is you really only have what's referred to as the 100 days to push through the vast majority of your stuff if you want to avoid the crawling through Congress as Congress revs up for the campaign cycle again. And of course, I'm not sure that the 6-year term would solve that, but there is still like if one candidate isn't running for re-election, then he'll have a greater ability to be independent of his own party. Like even if he becomes widely unpopular, like the candidate from his own party can run as like, oh, I'm from the other wing of that party. So I think maybe that would be
Okay, that's interesting.
Sheldon?
Alright, Ralph Hall is the representative from my district, and he's been there for like 30 some odd years. And there are many complaints that the district is so safe and there's such big name value here that he doesn't actually have to do anything in order to get reelected. And that, do you think that the term limit argument gets some boost in credibility from that sort of thing where, experience doesn't necessarily mean anything good, that a quote unquote inexperienced candidate may not necessarily have experience in that exact job but might know what they're doing in terms of politics and won't just get complacent and sit still and do nothing.
I do think, that's a good example of why term limits may be a good idea, just to get, if not anything else, just to get in new ideas. And I mean, it's not like, I mean, even if you place, like, say, a limit of 2 Senate terms, that's still 12 years in the Senate. And that's enough time to accrue substantial experience. And having not been in Congress myself, I'm not sure exactly what the congressional learning curve is. I mean, you do have very substantial support there in the form of your party, which is going to try to help you all it can because it wants to support its own members. Michael?
I think this gets into a broader issue, at least for me, in that I don't like this emphasis we have on career politicians. And so do you feel that, assuming you agree that that's necessarily a bad thing, do you feel that establishing term limits would help address this, or is there something more that we can do to make sure people don't serve terms in the House and then they become a senator and then they become president? By the time they become president, they haven't been in touch with the rest of the country for a while.
Well, that's where we run into a really tricky problem because to be president, you sort of do, I feel, have to have governmental experience. And maybe even not in Washington, maybe if governor's mansion is enough, but I do feel that, like, it's a very unique job, and I feel like you should, in reality, you are representing the American people, but you are going to be working with, I mean, the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, there's no way getting around it. So I do think that experience in that realm is necessary, but I do agree that, like, experience outside is also necessary as well. So I don't like the idea of people becoming politicians. I think maybe, like, congressional term limits would be valuable for that. Like, maybe it could be established, like, okay, you can serve in the House for 2 terms, and then maybe 4 years later you could run again, and maybe that would give time for, like, people to go back into the real world and sort of experience, like, you know, what people are dealing with and connect more with their constituents. Katie?